Greetings, friends of liberty. I shall again don the mantle of my American 21st century accent as we proceed in our analysis of the causes and origins of political correctness in the United States. This is indeed my present mission, returning to the France of the 21st century to deal with that petty tyrant Emmanuel Macron can wait. To recap where we left off last video, if we ask whether the exact same cause, the use of societal coercion sanctioned by the state, which has been influential in the rise or maintenance of the four ideologies, Christianity, Islam, communism, and fascism, has also been present in the rise of this new ideology of the woke, what do we find? Clearly, without any question, that it has. The totality of the governmental influence on higher education in America, expressed in the different coercive forms I'll outline, has grown severely over the last 50 to 70 years, but was also present earlier, dating back into the 19th century and even before in the milder versions of colonial times. And it is this governmental influence, expressed in the forms I'll describe below, along with others, that has led to our universities being colonized by PC doctrines. So what specifically were these coercive methods? Number one, the overwhelmingly nonprofit status of private colleges, privileged by the state in their tax exemptions on, for example, capital gains, which allow private universities to hoard huge multi-billion-dollar endowments, on sports income, normal income, tax-deductible donations, and property tax since colonial times, and also the third-party financing and funding of all public colleges and universities, which gives them a monopoly privilege. Number two, the huge amounts of federal monies given since World War II to both colleges and students, for whose receipt colleges need to conform to various civil rights laws and to the mandates of civil rights bureaucracies. And three, the various civil rights acts themselves, such as that of 1964 and the many following amendments and revisions, such as Title IX and the Civil Rights Act of 1991, along with the bureaucracies spawned from these, which compelled or influenced both businesses and universities to act in racist and a sexist manner and to conform to scrupulously politically correct behavior. So let's examine each of these three primary coercive factors in turn. To start, the degree to which present American nonprofit tax laws are coercive. Nonprofit status, the ideal. In a free society, charities would certainly exist, as America with its historically capitalist yet bountiful philanthropic record illustrates. But since institutions could be mixed in terms of offering some type of economic service, along with dispensing charity, these for-profit aspects would be taxed. However, the degree to which the institution itself would be charitable in the end, irrespective of whether it engaged in some economic activities, would depend on the extent to which private donors would simply add their own contributions and donations to the income, if any, derived from its activities. Thus, in many cases, obviously greatly increasing the funding and thus the roles the institution could perform. So we might thus rate institutions 0%, 43%, or 97% charitable, but their income and property would be taxed the same by the IRS for all these institutions regardless. So here's an example. Let's imagine a Catholic charity that gives free food and shelter to the homeless while helping them learn employable skills and referring them to psychological or medical treatment. Since it charges nothing, it has no income tax, but is liable for property tax on its property. Donors, as a consequence of surveying the institution and seeing how sincere, competent, and dedicated, let's imagine, management is, would donate vast amounts of money, which would easily pay the property tax, as well as in financing an increase in the services offered. However, whether the shelter in the next tax year received what would amount to this de facto waiving of its property tax would depend on how well, according to the donors or a private evaluative agency, it had performed. This is the way charitable institutions would be taxed in a free society. In effect, if they did a good job, the private sector would provide a voluntary tax rebate that could be so large as to easily compensate for any tax owed. Thus, in the U.S., the uniform tax exemptions granted to all nonprofit educational institutions act to insulate these institutions from the maximal effects of the judgments and funding decisions of the public, damaging the ability of the public to use its relevant local knowledge to regulate these institutions for both technical competence and qualitative factors, as in weeding out the politically correct ideas that are taught and represented by their faculty. In other words, in no conceivable world would the public grant a uniform tax exemption to all charitable institutions, but it would instead vary its treatment of them based on their perceived effectiveness, thus meaning that great institutions would receive large amounts and bad, small or none. In summary, in a free society, a range of educational institutions ranging from completely for-profit to non-profit would exist, especially since for-profit educational institutions throughout the world, in a context uninfluenced by governmental regulations and control, have proven superior. In any case, whether the charity came through the school or through a supportive private third party, a free society offers maximum philanthropic aid to productive young scholars, since, number one, it uses every educational dollar more efficiently anyway, and number two, can recognize promising poor scholars better, unlike, for example, the governmental Pell Grant program, which gives money to good and poor students alike. Secondly, and very importantly, is the following point about nonprofits. U.S. tax law has resulted in a nonprofit sector that, while by law is nonprofit, is in fact for-profit. But how is that possible, you might argue? The law specifically prohibits profit. But the law doesn't prohibit raising your expenses unnecessarily. And so nonprofits simply take their profits as unnecessarily increased expenses and pay that out to, in analyst Vance Fried's term, the administrative faculty collective. Clever indeed, those academics are. So what would be examples of this practice of nonprofit featherbedding? The following. You make sure you get a job for life, i.e. tenure, because academic freedom. You teach majors and courses that few people are really interested in. You reduce your teaching hours. You make sure you get long vacations and no classes before 10 a.m. You vote as a faculty collectively to increase your pay because, of course, you want your college to be as competitive as other colleges in terms of compensation offered. And finally, you do things like increase research costs, the amount of graduate education, as well as decrease the amount of undergraduate education because that's so boring and doesn't contribute to getting personal fame for you by publishing your research. What is the result of all these unnecessary increases in expenditure, both monetary and in-kind? The result for the students, Vance Fried estimates, is that the cost of producing undergraduate education, higher education, is doubled for many colleges. And of course, quality declines as well. So note also additionally that the fact that nonprofits don't care about legal profits, and thus cost, means that the cost of various other activities, such as being racist and sexist, are ignored by them in comparison with for-profit institutions. In other words, if you have a for-profit institution and you're racist, you'll lose tons of money. But you won't as much if you're a public institution, because that money will come from the legislature regardless, or more likely. As Thomas Sowell in 2004 observed, this lack of sensitivity to the real cost applies with regard to many types of public institutions and explains nowadays why public schools are teaching pure racism, sexism, and heterophobia to our children. In conclusion, let's ask, how does this ability to pad one's expenses in the tax code by receiving what amounts to either a tax subsidy in the case of private colleges or automatic state funding in the case of public, how does that lead to a more politically correct university? And very simply, because given that the vast majority of Americans still don't support politically correct institutions and rejected them even more in the past, if the average American educational institution were taxed and treated as for-profit, the greater control and use of personal knowledge and disgust for political correctness expressed by us, the public, through our direct educational purchases and through charitable giving, via the libertarian tax code outlined above, would provide significantly less or virtually no funding to woke institutions and their departments. Whether for-profit or charitable, in a free society, the proprietors of these institutions would be well aware that few Americans would want to pay for, fund, or become credentialed in politically correct ideologies. And that leads us to our final point for this video: increased federal subsidies. Federal subsidies to students and colleges. Since the amount of governmental money flowing to nonprofit colleges has increased enormously since World War II, both through the subsidies their students received, almost 50% for Harvard and Stanford, and through the direct aid to fund science and research projects, about 20%, that increased funding has helped create departments and disciplines out of whole cloth that otherwise either would never have existed or only in reduced form. So, for example, in much of the humanities, disciplines like Black studies, white studies, diversity studies, women's studies, queer studies, cultural studies, fat studies, and disability studies have little overall value and little reason to separate themselves from the general study of history or other affiliated disciplines. But it is precisely the scholars in these fields, not math, physics, and chemistry, leading the charge for political correctness. As a typical illustration, Shelby Steele, when interviewed by Bruce Bauer for his book Victims' Revolution, talked about the ease of getting money in the case of Black studies in the 60s and 70s, and gave numerous examples on pages 123 to 127. Paraphrasing, Steele made the following points. Number one, you could ask at that time a college for many tens of thousands of dollars to start anything like a library, and you just get it. Number two, Black studies had no rigor or academic discipline, and as a result was bad intellectually and academically. Number three, by the 80s there were hundreds and hundreds of these junky programs spread throughout colleges in the country. Number four, minorities got easy jobs this way, although they didn't deserve them by normal academic standards and criteria. Number five, the intellectual rot started there but then spread to other areas, like English departments and other disciplines of the humanities. 6, a result was that a whole generation of Black scholars have been corrupted by this process, and now we're seeing its poisoned fruits. A typical result of the misperceptions, bigotry, and hatred of non-Blacks and males now constantly promoted by these and other departments of the humanities in American higher education were already exposed over 15 years ago by that de facto Rorschach test, the Duke lacrosse case. When the alleged facts of the possible rape of a Black stripper by 3 white lacrosse players during a frat party were shown to be false, a group of 88 professors, largely from the humanities, continued to argue, as they had from the very beginning, without any real evidence, that the young men were guilty. Who were this group of 88? Overwhelmingly drawn from the now corrupted humanities department, not the hard sciences or from the law. The North Carolina state prosecutor, Mike Nafong, was later debarred for having tried to frame the young men, although he had only to spend 1 day in jail for his attempt to destroy their lives. And the president of Duke, Richard Broadhead, was careful not to stand up for the innocent, illustrating the intellectual and moral rot in the academy extending from top to bottom. To summarize then, in a free society, many of the useless departments and professors that display such political correctness would never exist or would be quickly eliminated for the reasons just articulated. The judgments of free societies are more productive given that they use much more knowledge and given that property owners know they will bear the consequences of their bad decisions. And number two, there wouldn't be the extra money taken from the taxpayer to fund these programs and departments anyway. Secondly, the vastly increased governmental funding funneled through this system comes with the requirement that colleges conform to all state and federal civil rights legislation enacted since 1964. This requirement in one fell swoop means that all applicable private institutions have now become quasi-public in having to conform their behavior to governmental mandates and guidelines or go bankrupt. Thus, when people nowadays say private colleges are just as or even more woke than public, what they misperceive is that private colleges now really mean quasi-public colleges. So this concludes, dear listener, our second video on the origins of political correctness. In the third, we shall treat of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent civil rights legislation that have created an important follow-on effect of the bad ideologies that have colonized these politically privileged universities and the garbage ideologies that this video has focused on. Until then, I wish you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.